Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 514, Zhukov arrives at Stalingrad. Last time, with Case Blue activated, Army Group A of Army Group South was making impressive headway towards the oil fields of the Caucasus, while Army Group B approached Stalingrad. And as the days of August 1942 went by, the panzers of the 1st Panzer Army came ever closer to Baku. As detrimental as that was for Moscow, even worse, Army Group B, attacking Stalingrad, had already occupied Voronezh, specifically the 2nd German Army, which is located about 350 miles or 563 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad. And Voronezh was about the same distance to Moscow. Thus, if Stalingrad was taken before the Russians could recover, Army Group B might well turn north to threaten the capital from the south. And with Army Group Center still only 144 miles or 231 kilometers west of the capital, Stalin might be looking at a two-pronged approach. Things may yet begin to unravel for the Soviet leader. As for both Army Groups A and B, they were finding their objectives from Hitler enlarged, while their forces were being reduced by Hitler. First, General Erich von Manstein, the conqueror of Crimea and his 11th Army, which should have stayed with Army Group South, had been ordered north to help lay siege to Leningrad. Next, two of the best Panzer Grenadier or motorized infantry divisions of Army Group A were to head to France. As previously covered, the Allies had attempted to raid the French port of Dieppe. That it had gone horribly wrong for the Allies was not the point. General Rundstedt, in command of occupied France, was now nervous and stressing Hitler out with his calls for reinforcements. Might not Dieppe be the first of a series of raids? Hitler agreed and ordered the two Panzer Grenadier divisions back west. When Hitler was complained to about this move, his answer was simply, the 8th Italian, 2nd Hungarian, and 3rd and 4th Romanian armies would compensate, yet they all lacked training, and more besides, they lacked artillery and anti-tank guns. And with his imperfect band of brothers, who were also stretched out, General Paulus and his 6th Army reached the Don River and crossed it on July 25th, now about 20 miles or 32 kilometers west of Stalingrad. And though General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army would be on his right flank, he was not there yet. Still, for his own reasons, probably thinking speed was best, Paulus tried to approach Stalingrad on his own with his exhausted 6th Army. But what they ran into was a well-dug-in Soviet defense, determined to resist. Paulus still kept his men at this for 4 days. They achieved little, except increasing their own wounded. Calling off the attack, he would now wait for Hoth and his foreign allies. Hoth was in place by August 14th, and Paulus set it down thus. The attack on Stalingrad would commence on August 19th. Meanwhile, to the south, driving on Baku, General Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army, was spitting mad. One of the main reasons his drive south was going so well was because he had the 8th Luftwaffe Corps of Richthofen flying overhead, many miles ahead, to ascertain which bridges were still intact, where enemy pockets were, and when they found them, to engage them. This allowed his panzers, when not fighting, to travel at speed. First, his Panzer Grenadier had been taken from him. Now his air umbrella was gone. It was heading to Stalingrad, and soon his Flak Corps would be removed as well, also making for Stalingrad, as the fighting there was not going according to plan. And though this would have happened anyway, before Army Group A could approach Grozny, hundreds of Soviet bombers would be stationed there to harass Kleist and his. In time, but far too late, Stalingrad would be seen as a black hole, sucking in everything around it, only for the men and weapons to disappear. As Army Group B tried to enter Stalingrad, a characteristic of the war in the East was about to change, one of many changes. Thus far, the panzers were a threat because they brought firepower and speed to the battlefield. But there was one more aspect that probably kept the Stavka up at night. Because of their speed and their ability to traverse almost any terrain, they could and did turn on a dime. What was an apparent target in the morning was left behind for another target in the afternoon, which is why, despite their superior numbers, the Soviets had to cover everything of value instead of focusing their numbers. But now, that German advantage was gone. Yes, Army Group South was on the move, but its objective, Baku, was known. It was the same with Stalingrad. Thus, the numbers of men and weapons being sent to those two places only increased as fall of 1942 approached. To counter this, the Axis formations had only one answer: to take their objectives before those reinforcements arrived.
As a long-time foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places. Nowhere as important to the world as China. But these days, few journalists are able to get the inside story. That's because China has shut the door to much of the media.
Authorities have far more efficient tools to control the press, and they're far less reluctant to use them.
I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the US versus China, we're trying to break through. We'll talk about Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
As we have seen on the far German left, 14th Panzer Corps had crossed the Don River and was now heading east for the Volga, northeast of Stalingrad. As this attack was just above the defending Soviet formations, they left the Germans alone, as the 16th Panzer Division, the leading unit of General Gustav von Wittersheim's 14th Panzer Corps, reached the Volga by that afternoon. And as the majority of the city is on the northern side of the Volga, it seemed this battle was over before it had truly started. This was on August 22nd. The next day, August 23rd, this same force, the 16th Panzer Division, reached the city's northern limits. Now, the panzers might not be able to maneuver as if in an open field, but so far, all the Soviets had going for them were numbers, not quality. So the 16th Panzer Division moved ever closer. The fighting here will be covered in a moment, but the result was, it did not go well for the invaders. True, they delivered many casualties to the enemy, but they lost too many themselves. This was not a wise exchange, so Paulus turned to Richthofen, and the air commander responded with the largest aerial bombardment of the Eastern Front so far. That night, after the initial clash of ground forces, 1,200 bombers hit Stalingrad. This had taken the entirety of 4th Luftwaffe Corps, plus long-range bombers being called in from other fronts. But by morning, huge swaths of the city were gutted. Of course, there was a downside to this. But first, one of the reasons for Richthofen's intense response was that, simply, he wanted the Battle of Stalingrad over. During this bombing of the city, he only lost 3 planes, but prior to this, his men had been flying many low-level missions, directly attacking Soviet tanks, and unacceptable losses had resulted. Even his fighters had been ordered by Berlin to directly attack enemy ground positions versus simply taking out the enemy's aircraft. But having done a night's work of turning Stalingrad into hell, it was now a, though rather pained, paradise for the defenders, relatively speaking. Not only were there piles of rubble for the Soviets to hide behind everywhere, now the Germans would have to take their time to clear the streets before advancing. In time, the Sixth Army would be bled dry, trying to navigate these obstacles while fighting. Still, for the next 48 hours, more than 40,000 Russians would die as a result of these bombings. While the Soviet men, military and civilian, fought the Axis raiders, to the north, west, and southeast, the Russian women manned the AA guns. True, they had not saved their city from 2 days of air attacks, but they learned of their enemy, and that information would be put to good use later. So while the men fought behind the barricades and the women sent hot metal into the skies, and Stalin tried to instill a sense of comradeship and defiance with phrases like, "All those who can carry a rifle must protect their native city and homes," his local commanders were lining up their own men and shooting every 10th soldier. This was a warning to those thinking of surrendering or running away. And before the Battle of Stalingrad was over, the Soviets would shoot just over 14,000 of their own people. So again, it was on August 23rd that General Paulus launched his Sixth Army for its main attack. And yet, the defenders resisted, though the quality of this resistance varied greatly. To the north of the city, many worker militia battalions were sent to engage the enemy, i.e. the panzers. They did little damage to the enemy's tanks and lost many of their lives, but it took time for the Germans to kill or push back all these people before advancing. As for the proper Soviet soldiers, they too died in great numbers, but caused damage as they went down, and again, this ate up time. To the west of Stalingrad and to the southeast, infantry and panzers were held up, mostly. They advanced ever closer to the Volga, but lost more men than Paulus thought they should have. No matter, reinforcements were on the way, due on September 3rd. This clash between the two sides went on for the next few days. Then, heavy rains poured from the sky on August 27th, which brought the direct fighting to a halt. The men of both sides were grateful for the rest. Using his time wisely, General Hoth of the 4th Panzer Army studied his maps and the current dispositions of the opposing side. He knew this had to end quickly, as the previous fall, again they were coming up to that time this year, there would come rains that would ruin the roads and ruin the Germans' vehicles' ability to travel upon them. No, this had to end, and he believed he had spied out a way. When the rain stopped 2 days later, August 29th, Hoth's panzers moved out, hitting a relatively weak spot in the enemy's lines. A hole was made, the panzers poured through. From here, Hoth had two choices, both good. He could make for the Volga and establish a bridgehead to approach the city from the south, but deeming it too soon, instead, he would turn left or north when close to the river and encircle the Soviet 64th Army opposing him. But General Yeremenko had been studying his maps as well. And just as soon as a hole was made in his line, he ordered the 64th back, and most escaped. They would live to fight another day. While the Soviet troops and civilian militia were barely holding back the invaders, 3 Soviet armies were being assembled just north of the German Second Army's position, Army Group B's far left flank. The idea was to attack from there and force those Axis forces north of Stalingrad to pull back to the west. This would be a great victory for Mother Russia. But then General Zhukov arrived on August 29th to review these men, and he was beyond disappointed. Many, too many, were too old for this. They lacked artillery, they lacked tanks, and their morale was, of course, low. In short, their attack would end the way that so many other armies had ended the first 6 months of Barbarossa. And that would not do here. Zhukov called the Stavka and Stalin and explained the situation and gave his opinion that to attack now would be a complete waste and asked for more time. This was grudgingly approved, but he was warned by Stalin himself, do not lose Stalingrad. While the Soviet marshal was trying to make lemonade out of lemons, Hoth had done it. By September 3rd, his forces were along the Volga to the south of Stalingrad. Also, Paulus's other forces were to its north along the Volga. The city was all but cut off. One may choose their own metaphor here. The city was in the vice of crocodile jaws, or the hammer was about to rain down blows, while the anvil would not allow retreat. Take your pick. Either way, this was almost over. And that's what Paulus wrote to Field Marshal Wieks at Army Group B headquarters and to Hitler. Of course, news of this also reached Stalin, who contacted Zhukov personally and practically yelled his side of the conversation, ending with, "Attack now. Delay is the equivalent of a crime." And Stalin only had one punishment for a crime against the state. But Zhukov knew his Stalin. Yes, he would attack, but did not expect much to come from it. And he was right. Waiting another 48 hours and working on the three armies as much as they could, when those Soviet forces moved south on September 5th, they aimed at the rear of those northern Axis forces trying to come down on the city's northern approaches. But all it led to was death and destruction for the Soviets. By the time the fighting was over, the Germans now had another 26,500 prisoners and had destroyed 350 guns and 830 tanks. Guns, soldiers, and tanks that Zhukov could have used to much better advantage if given the time. But orders were orders.
Hello everyone, my name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. My podcast is a mostly chronological retelling of the Second World War, and I hope you will join me on a journey through the most cataclysmic conflict in human history, as we try to answer the questions of not just what and where, but how and why. Join me on a journey not just through the famous campaigns, battles, and events, but also on a trip around the globe as we broaden the scope of Second World War history beyond the well-known battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. During weekly episodes, I seek to provide new insight for longtime students of the war, while also being a great jumping-on point for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the Second World War. This podcast has made it to the invasion of Poland in 1939, and start listening now to find out how the world would find itself embroiled in its second worldwide conflict in just 20 years. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.
Seeing this latest defeat as a complete waste, he made up his mind. Zhukov would not save Stalingrad by attacking. The Axis were still too strong for that. No, he would defend the city, and he would let the enemy come to him. He would use his building forces to feed just enough men into the city to keep it his, all the while building an overwhelming reserve that one day would attack, as Stalin wished. Going further, Zhukov knew that the Germans were masters of the open field combat with their panzers, half-tracks, planes, artillery, coordination, and communications that made it all possible. But most of that would be negated if they were fighting street to street. So that's where the fighting would take place. Let the Germans come in. Let them think the end was near. But he, Zhukov, would tally up the men he lost each day and send in that number to replace them. Let the enemy break themselves on Russia's seemingly numberless amount of men amongst the chaos that was the streets of Stalingrad, thanks to their own air attacks. No, it would not be short and decisive. It would be drawn out. It would stress Stalin. But it would be decisive. And as if General Paulus was working hand in hand with Zhukov, his attack plan would dovetail beautifully with the Marshals. Postscript. About 25 miles to the northwest of Stalingrad is the town of Veryachi, which sits on the Don River. On August 23rd, the German 16th Panzer and the 3rd Motorized Divisions fought their way across. With a force of 120 tanks and 200 armored personnel carriers, the Soviets were unable to hold them back. But instead of heading to the southeast, to the heart of the city, it was too early for that. Instead, the panzers and personnel carriers went due east. Still, the Soviet 138th Rifle Regiment and the 137th Tank Brigade near the Volga River readied themselves as best they could. Yet their efforts were overwhelmed not by those tanks or carriers, but by the ground attack aircraft of Henschel HS-129s. These planes were made for just such an occasion, having been built after the Luftwaffe's experiences in the Spanish Civil War. To combat returning small arms fire from the ground, the HS-129 had a steel lining and tiny windows protecting its crew of one. Initially having 2 MG-17 machine guns and 2 20mm MG cannon to fire on those below, it could also wipe out a cluster of enemy troops or vehicles with its 2 50-kilogram or 110-pound bombs. Other planes carried 4 50-kilogram or 110-pound fragmentation bombs. Point is, its characteristics had been desired by pilots who had fought in Spain to support ground troops, and after trial and error, this machine was effective at attacking ground troops, as the Soviets were finding out. The Soviets kept falling back, either closer to the Volga River or back towards the city, which is exactly what the 16th Panzer and 3rd Motorized Divisions wanted. Still, on August 23rd, the attackers reached the railway line near the Volga. Now, the main rail line was cut. No more direct deliveries from the north, and the Volga River was no longer safe for supply ships. At 3 p.m., a panzer detachment, along with Kampfgruppe 2 of the 2nd Battalion of the 64th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 16th Panzer, reached the northern suburbs of the city. More importantly, they were close to the Stalingrad tractor factory. As the Germans approached, the Soviet 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment readied to resist. They were protecting the tractor factory and a nearby ferry. Most of these handling the weapons, but not all, were men, while the majority of the regiment's rangefinders were women. But like most Soviet units at this point, the AA crews were undertrained, underfed, and were fighting with relatively weak weapons, considering they were going up against tanks. Instead of having armor-piercing rounds, most had fragmentation flak rounds. Again, they were an AA regiment. As the lead panzers of the 16th Panzer Division approached the Gumrak Airport, one of 7 around Stalingrad, located about 15 kilometers or 9 miles northwest of the city, the men and women of the AA regiment readied themselves. As the panzers approached, the female rangefinders passed information on to the gunners, who let fly. The battle was on. Having more success against the motorized infantry carriers than the tanks, the former were focused on. This brought the German machine gunners up short, which caused the panzers to hesitate, as they would be going in unaided. The fighting here went on for 2 days, August 23rd and the 24th. And Soviet reports indicated that 28 tanks had been destroyed. This is most likely exaggerated, along with 15 carriers and 14 enemy aircraft, most likely the HE-29s, which was definitely inflated. Still, this was too much loss of resources for Paulus. No, he would call on Richthofen. The bombing would begin. The Sixth Army would not be denied. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So on a personal note, the cold has passed, the snow has passed. It might come back, but this week is supposed to be in the 50s. Oh my God, I'm so excited. So anyways, I'm sorry, I just wanted to share that with you. Have you ever had something in your life just take over completely? The cold has done that. The snow has done that. February has felt like a good year and a half. Anyway, it's still not over, obviously, but it's about to be. So I'm just more giddy than I should be. I apologize for what I just said. Anyways, so welcoming aboard, strangely enough, not new members, but members. Let me explain. First of all, there's John Simmons, who I met in Australia when I visited Cameron Riley, my podcasting partner. John's a great guy. He drove us around. He took us to an animal park. It was amazing. So John, thank you very much. He's back on board after taking a break. And Bruce Ryan is at Guelph, Ontario, Canada. I hope I said that right, Bruce. I'm so sorry. Anyways, he was a member. Something happened, tech stuff, and then he came back. So John and Bruce, thank you very much for coming back into the fold. No donations this week, so I guess I just won't drink beer this week. Think about that. Anyway, so we're into Stalingrad proper. You've seen the mistakes that Hitler's making. There are several. And we'll just watch as Zhukov just brilliantly feeds in just enough to keep the fight going. He keeps the Germans' hopes up, and it doesn't go anywhere. So we'll cover all this, and obviously what's going on in the South as well. But you can see the beginning of the end of the unraveling of Army Group South, which of course will affect everything else. So we'll get to that as soon as we can. So I hope the weather is better in your area as it is in mine, and even if it's not, take care, everyone.
I'm Dr. Samuel Hume, and I'm here to tell you about my new podcast, Winds of Change. Winds of Change is the story of how the sun set on the British Empire. This first season is on British India, and in these weekly episodes, we'll cover the whole history through to the final days of the Raj in 1947. If you love learning about the past and discovering why the world is the way it is, then listen to Winds of Change. You can listen to Winds of Change on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere you find great podcasts.